Fellow Cambrians and friends, this presidential lecture comes to you from my home in Nottinghamshire. It's my first video lecture, so I hope that you will allow for inexperience and pardon any technical blips. Despite the circumstances, I am indeed very honoured to have been invited to be your president, and like many predecessors, I imagine, amazed to find myself in such august company. As a medieval historian, my default instinct is to look back. In that role of honour, I recognise many renowned scholars who have contributed so notably to Celtic studies in the broadest terms, a few of whom I have personally known. Here, however, I restrict myself to one specific distant link to the past, to our founding father, Sir Stephen Glyn, President in 1847-8. He was rector of St Daniel's, Harden. There he baptised, married and buried several of my Jones ancestors. A successor also later baptised me, not far from Sir Stephen's tomb. In my youth, villagers still spoke with respect and affection of Rector Glyn. He had set standards by which others were later judged, and often found wanting. I trust that he would be curious about some of the things I have to say, if only because he had visited and left notes on some of the churches which I shall mention. Since this was originally scheduled for our summer meeting in Lincoln, I have tried to combine my long interest in medieval Brittany with another, more local one that has developed over the years, especially since I have long been a member of the Lincoln Record Society and had the privilege of being its president between 2007 and 2015. So, Bretons in medieval Lincolnshire, the House of Richmond and other connections, 1066 to 1399. West Ravendale enters the historical record at Domesday Book, like so many other English towns and villages. Midway between Grimsby and Louth, and part of the large manor of Waltham, the lord was Alan of Brittany, Alan Rufus, who died in 1093. It's the connection between the Count Dukes of Brittany, their great feudal honour of Richmond granted to Alan by William the Conqueror, and especially its Lincolnshire estates, that is one of my main themes. I will preface it with some evidence for Breton settlement in the county. I conclude mainly with ways Lincolnshire's Bretons contributed to various cultural, mainly religious developments. England's second largest county, Lincolnshire is over 80 miles from north to south, nearly 50 miles east to west at its widest. In the Middle Ages it became one of England's major centres of agrarian production, as it remains. Predominantly low-lying, there was very little land that was not eventually used for arable or grazing. High-quality Lincolnshire wool was its most famous medieval export. West Ravendale can be used as a case study of the enduring links that were created after the conquest between Lincolnshire and Brittany. In 1202, when founding the Abbey of Beauport in northern Brittany, Count Alan of Gwellow, who had inherited land of his great-uncle, Count Alan Rufus, transferred to Beauport the rights of presentation of 10 churches in the Soak of Waltham. His grant led to the establishment of a small priory by the abbey. Little now survives, as Pevsner long ago noted. But West Ravendale will concern us again. First, some evidence for Bretons in Lincolnshire after 1066. An important Breton contingent fought at Hastings. Some of its leaders were early rewarded with Lincolnshire estates. The most important early documentary evidence comes from Domesday Book, the Lindsay Survey of 1115 to 18, and a wealth of 11th and 12th century charters. Chancery rolls, exchequer and legal records then swell the resources from 1200 onwards. They provide ample information on the holdings of tenants-in-chief led by Count Alan and lesser figures of Breton origin. Above all, their personal names furnish a probable, if not certain, guide to ethnic origins in a period when distinctive naming patterns were evolving. It is these that help us to trace local Breton descents over many generations. Around the middle of the 11th century, when many Bretons who came to England after 1066 were born, the stock of Breton personal names consisted of two distinct groups. These reflected the division of the duchy between those who spoke Breton and those speaking French. The latter lived mainly in eastern Brittany, Bretagne Gallo. At that period, Celtic names predominated throughout Brittany, but those of Romance origin were becoming more prevalent. It was then that Bretons adopted the names that they would use longest and most widely. Overall, names of Celtic origin reduced in number, though many distinctive ones were still used by those who moved to England, like Jichel, Guigon, Jarnigan or Morvan. At the same time, the Breton practice of using only a single name, as was then widely the case in Western Europe, began to be replaced by patronyms, thus Alan, son of Brian, just as in the medieval Welsh practice. Happily, this habit long continued among many of Breton descent in England, before what is still our current practice emerged, a two-element name, a forename and a surname, widespread by the 13th century. Many Breton families in England also helpfully used alternating naming patterns from generation to generation, especially for eldest sons. So Jarnigan, son of Hugh, holding one knight's fee under the honour of Richmond around 1210, was the great-grandson of Hugh, father of Jarnigan, of King Stephen's reign. Some families continued this practice even after 1300. As time passed, trends developed obscuring the Breton presence. Most settlers came from Bretagne Gallo. They were already closely connected to their Angevin and Norman neighbours by 1066. The links continued when they crossed the Channel. There was also a strong tendency to adopt names common among the Anglo-Norman elite, like Geoffrey, Robert, Thomas or William. This disguised different ethnic origins. Intermarriage with neighbours, whatever their distant roots, further promoted the spread of Romance names. This makes those of Breton descent less easy to distinguish as time passed. By 1200, whatever their origin, there was also a growing sense of Englishness amongst the country's population at large. A final general remark is that the traditional geographical boundary between where Breton-speaking or French-speaking people predominated, called the Lean Lot, after a famous scholar who first seriously studied the question, had been slowly moving westwards since the 9th century. By 1200, it had largely stabilised on a line between Saint-Nazaire at the mouth of the Loire and Saint-Brieuc. It retreated very little further west until after 1500. But Lot's line was never a linguistic frontier. In other words, all those who bore Breton names did not necessarily speak Breton, and vice versa. That depended on very complex considerations. This is particularly true of those with Celto-Breton names in England. Most probably did not speak Breton. With these points in mind, let's consider Bretons in Lincolnshire. We have already seen certain common but distinctive names should alert us to a possible Breton presence. We are on even firmer ground with rarer names. Many were first recorded in the 9th and 10th century charters of the great abbey of Saint-Sauveur de Redon, because they were so distinct for a long time, a single name was sufficient for witnessing purposes, even when two-element name had become common. Thus, a later Jarnaghan, bailiff of Lincoln in 1269, normally just used his given name to testify. Sometimes, however, he's called Jarnaghan of Newport, using a toponymic second element by then common practice. It presumably indicated that he lived close to Lincoln's old Roman gate, Newport Arch, just one man of distinct Breton descent making a career in the medieval city. The most common Breton name in Lincolnshire was Alan, a very good example of the complex considerations mentioned above. It was first used exclusively by the counts that ruled in southwestern Brittany between the 9th and 11th centuries. It gradually spread in popularity at all social levels, so that by 1250, with Udo, they were the most popular Breton names, alongside the two most common Romance ones, Geoffroy and Guillaume. The same happened in Lincolnshire. The local reason seems obvious: deference to and emulation of the leading Breton family in the county, that of Count Alan Rufus, whom we met at West Ravendale. He was a son of Count Udo, a younger brother of Duke Alan III, who died in 1040. But as in Brittany, a name exclusive to a powerful dynasty was adopted by lesser families before 1100. In the same way, another name enjoying popularity was Conan. Its usage was reinforced locally when Conan IV, son of Alan III, Earl of Richmond, succeeded as both Earl of Richmond and Duke of Brittany in 1154. But it too was already in more general use by 1100. Nearly 90 years ago, one of Lincolnshire's outstanding medievalists, Kathleen Major, began to publish with a study of Conan, son of Ellis, died 1218, a leading inhabitant of Holbeach, a fourth-generation Lincolnshire Breton. To make his mark, was Conan, priest, vicar, sacrist, and archdeacon of Lincoln, holder of property in Pottergate, Lincoln. Not every Alan, Conan, or Udo whom we meet by 1200 will have descended from Breton counts, but the probability is very high. By the later 14th century, however, the fashion for Breton names had passed. Very few were still in circulation except for Alan. Taking the poll tax returns for 1377 to 1381 as a sample, Alan was the seventh most popular among over 2,000 taxpayers in the Boston area in 1381. But no Brians or Conans were recorded, only two Udos and a single Ellis and Joss. On the other hand, there is a small scatter of once given Breton first names now used as surnames. Among the tax collectors in Lindsay in 1377, we find Robert Elwis, John Elliot, Richard Jekyll, Simon Gigot, and Richard Wymark, all Bretons by descent. A similar development allows us to continue tracing such descents in the most common case. Instead of the patronymic form Alan, son of Brian, many ordinary Lincolnshire families by the 14th century used the form Brian, Alan's son. Numerous sons of Alan were also adopted Alanson, abbreviated sometimes to Allison, as a surname. John Allison, who occurs in 1263, is an early example. Others more directly recall 300 years after the conquest their distant origins, like Walter, son of Alan Brett, alias Walter Brett, or Walter Alanson Brett at Horncastle in 1385. Fewer distinctive female names were in use among Bretons in the county. By the mid-12th century, the most widespread was Wymarker. The best evidence comes from the first surviving assize roll for Lincolnshire in 1202. Here we glimpse the lives led by fairly ordinary women like Waymarka, deceased of property, Waymarka of Hawkstow, in dispute over her dower, Waymarka Joy, and Waymarka, daughter of Alan of Ryby, both alleging rape. Like male names, Breton female names fell out of fashion. In the Boston poll tax records in 1381, for instance, from a sample of 1,605 female names, no fewer than which 85 given names are listed. Yet of possible Breton origin, there was only one Wimmer and a few Constances. A final example to reinforce conclusions based on personal name evidence. On meeting in Charters, Jickle of Yarborough, son of Alan, and his nephew Ralph, son of Brian, quit claiming Elias Moisson, we can be fairly certain all were Bretons by descent. If further proof is needed, a final concord in 1183 reveals Jickle as steward of the Richmond Soak of Gayton the Wold. Other charters show that he had married a Waymarka. Ralph's father is called Brian de Bretagne, and the surname Moisson is frequently encountered in both Lincolnshire and in Brittany. Laundry, in fact, local antiquaries long ago established that Jickle was a great-grandson of the Domesday tenant of Gayton, Laundry. In the 13th century, Jickle became a family surname. The same happened for the ethnonym Brito, frequently found in charters post-1066. It too became a proper name. Thus Simon le Bret, who owed 2 knights for castle guard at Richmond around 1180, one at Wrangle in Holland, was successor to Ralph Brito of Henry I's day. He had a son, also Simon le Bret. In an extent of Richmond honour in Lincolnshire in 1280 to 82, Nicholas le Breton held land in Fulbeck, Philip de Breton held half a fee at Welton, and so on. A century later, among the taxpayers of Holbeach in 1381 were Thomas and Stephen Britton. Brito and its derivatives occur much more frequently in Lincolnshire than other French ethnonyms like Angevin, Poitevin and Norman. The only one approaching it in prevalence in the 12th century is Fleming. This is not surprising, given the close ties between Lincolnshire and the Low Countries, but it remains firmly in second place. A systematic search for such distinctive Breton names and naming patterns might one day determine much more accurately the density of Breton settlement in the county. Nevertheless, the evidence cited suggests that it was considerable, showing many of Breton descent from a wide social range firmly established after 1066. Is their arrival reflected in local place names? Unlike the invasions of the early Middle Ages, the Norman conquest did not at first result in major changes to English place names. This happened only gradually, for example, by adding names denoting the arrival of a new governing elite. Boothby Pagnell, Carlton Paynell and Melton Ross are good local examples. But those of English ancestry were also remembered, as at Burton Pedwardine or Carlton Kyme. Generally, incoming families adopted already existing toponyms as surnames. Only one place name now preserved in Treehampton Drive in Lee near Gainsborough has been traced back to Brittany. There it first occurs as a personal name, Treanton, in Redlawn Charters. In the Lindsay Survey, Geoffrey, son of Treatoun, held land in Lee. By the 13th century, his descendants lived in a moated manor house there, once called after them, Treehampton. The minor name Brittifen in Wrangle that occurs in 1202 seems to have been named after one of the principal families, that of Simon Brito, mentioned above. In 1247, a final concord refers to the land of the Bretons at Lednam, signifying the honour of Richmond. There was Bretland in Swinshead in the early 14th century. Elsewhere, Brian of Yarborough was remembered around 1250 by a footpath called Brian's Tee, while Brian's Park, lying between Yarborough and Alvingham, occurs in at least 9 Alvingham charters. But until the English Place Name Society volumes of Lincolnshire are complete, if then, it will not be possible to establish how long such minor names were used or whether they are still extant. So the pickings are thin in contrast to personal name evidence. Can we use that to say more about the general pattern of Breton settlement? A few Bretons had already settled in Lincolnshire before the conquest. The most important, usually named by his English title, was Ralph the Staller, son of a Breton father and an Anglo-Saxon mother, born about 1010. Ralph witnessed on both sides of the Channel for nearly 40 years. Rising in Edward the Confessor's service, among rewards were extensive lands in Lincolnshire. After the conquest, he became Earl of East Anglia. His son by an unknown Breton lady, and named after his Breton patrimony, Raoul de Gale, succeeded him. But in 1075 Raoul revolted and lost all his English lands. In addition to Ralph the Staller, J.H. Round, many years ago, drew attention to another Breton, Alfred of Lincoln. He was succeeded by Alan, through whose daughter Alfred's land descended, forming the barony of Thorsway. In Domesday, among Alfred's tenants were several with continental names, including Gley and Jocelyn. Gley was ancestor of the Rothwells of Lincolnshire. Jocelyn, son of Lambert, usually described by modern authorities as Norman, was father of Gilbert, founder of the mixed order of Sempringham. As he may have crossed the Channel with Alfred, it is not inconceivable that he too was a Breton, since Jocelyn and Lambert were then names current in Brittany. Of the 59 lay tenants-in-chief in Lincolnshire in 1086, at least 6 apart from Count Alan had impeccable Breton credentials. Geoffrey de la Guerche was a younger son of Sylvester, Bishop of Rennes, brother of Guillaume, Seigneur of La Guerche. He was rewarded with a compact block of manors in the Isle of Axholme. Still flourishing around 1093, Geoffrey did not put down lasting roots. After 2 short-lived successors, his Axholme estates were given to the Norman Nigel of Aubigny, progenitor of the Mowbrays, Dukes of Norfolk, with whom Axholme remained for the rest of the Middle Ages. More successful in establishing themselves were Auger the Breton and Guy de Cron. At Domesday, most of Auger's Lincolnshire lands were in Averland wapentake. Some had been occupied unjustly. Others, it was once thought, Auger acquired because he married Hereward the Wake's daughter. This has been comprehensively dismissed by modern scholarship as the familial myth of the Anglo-Norman Wake family, barons of Bourne, descendants of whom are still extant. Auger left 2 sons, including Conan. Guy de Cron was a younger son of Robert I, Lord of Vitré, and his Angevin wife, Bertha de Cron. By 1086, he held substantial lands widely scattered in Lincolnshire, including Fenland manors forming the future barony of Freeston. This descended in a direct line until the death of his great-grandson Guy, circa 1205, by when the Cron were well entrenched. At Freeston itself, the number of tenants doubled between 1086 and 1307, while witnesses in 1315 recalled muddling Count Earl Alan III and Alan de Cron, Guy's successor, that the first major sluice constructed at Boston, an important development in Stephen's reign, was owed to Count Alan of Cron. Eudo, son of Spirewick, was ancestor of the most successful Breton family of baronial rank in Lincolnshire. Eudo had very likely been one of Raoul de Gale's men. His son Hugh owed 2 knights' service in Henry I's day, when his properties lay in 7 wapentakes, with his main holdings around Tattershall on the northern edge of the fens. Along with the Cron, the Tattershalls also owned land on the west bank of the Witham in Boston, enjoying lucrative fair rights. As the distribution map shows, while some holdings were concentrated in small areas, Axholme, Everland, Wapentake, few parts of the county lacked a Breton presence, as the anthroponymic evidence has already suggested. But the remarkable transformation in economic fortunes of the parts of Holland, thanks to reclamation between the later 11th and 13th centuries, gave those who possessed land in that region special advantages. Among them were the Lords of the Honour of Richmond, the Cron family and the Tattershalls, but also lesser figures like the Moultons of Moulton and Frampton. They were a family of English descent whose rise in the world owed much to serving the Count Dukes of Brittany. The evolution of the Honour of Richmond helps us to understand this. The great feudal honour of Richmond took shape in the late 11th century, with estates across 11 counties by Doomsday. Those Count Alan and his successors held in Lincolnshire were amongst their most important. As an administrative entity whose lords, barons and men came to enjoy many particular privileges, the honour survived until the end of the Middle Ages. It was one of the longest-lasting feudal lordships, absorbed by the Crown only on the accession of Henry VII by right Earl of Richmond. Down to 1399, its history was inextricably linked to Brittany and its rulers. It was after the rebellion of Earl Morcar and the death of Earl Edwin in 1071 that Alan acquired estates in northwestern Yorkshire around Gilling and Catterick. The revolt of Raoul de Gale brought Alan not only extensive property in East Anglia, but also the core of his Lincolnshire lands. By Doomsday, they represented, after holdings in Cambridgeshire, his most valuable resources, constituting around 20% of the total value of the honour. Boston was firmly established as a new town by successive Count Earls. Acting as the outport for Lincoln, the 4th or 5th largest city in the kingdom, ensured its growth. Although kept under close seigneurial supervision, it flourished to the point that by 1300 it rivaled London as the premier port for exporting English wool. There is no time to examine the question in detail, but by 1300 Lincolnshire provided around 40% of manorial income. Count Alan did not retain all the manors he received, enfeoffing mean tenants, but other land accrued to his successors. There was, however, some rationalisation. Isolated states were sacrificed, and an increasing concentration on central and coastal properties. It was with these latter areas that were transformed by reclamation into some of the richest and most densely settled parts of the kingdom. Embankment against the sea had already begun by 1066. In the next 2 centuries, over 100 square miles of new land was added around Boston alone, in a process in which the Count Earls of Richmond and their main tenants played a leading role. Thus, a final concord of 1198 records an agreement between Thomas II of Malton and the Prior of Spalding over 20 acres of land in the Marsh of Malton in enlargement of his tenement. In 1205, Thomas II gave the priory and the villagers of Spalding and Sibsey land in a new take abutting the new ditch of the Marsh of Weston, two of many such agreements. A 1316 survey for Thomas V of Malton of his Lordship of Fleet provides further remarkable evidence of how the Fenland communities exploited, often collectively, their new lands, transforming the landscape of that part of the county. The same happened in the Lindsey Marsh in the northeast and along the Humber. One reason for the changing consistency of the Count Earl's English estates has been mentioned: enfeoffment of mean tenants. Another reason was the generosity of Count Earl and his tenants to religious houses. Over 1,300 acres of land alone in the Soak of Gayton, for instance, was given to the church in the 12th and 13th centuries, much of it by Jekyll of Yarborough and his family. Since the Count Earls did not have a major castle in Lincolnshire, their mean tenants owed castle guard at Richmond. Lists survive of when the knights were to perform their 2-month stint of watch duties. Totals hover around 180 fees for the whole honour. In one dating from Henry I's time, among the Lincolnshire knights, Alan, son of Udo of Mumby, and Wigan, son of Landry, each owed 5 knights. Conan, son of Auger, 6, and William de la Mare, 7, for a total of 43 knights owing castle guard. A century later, in 1280-82, the extent shows Lincolnshire providing again around 40 knights for the service of Richmond. By then, however, personal service had been commuted at the standard rate of 10 shillings per fee a year. Another century on, it was still the same as accounts of Skirbeck Soak for 1367 record. After personal feudal military service declined, exaction of this symbolic payment was one of the most constant reminders to leading manorial tenants of their obligations to its lord. They were also summoned regularly to his courts. The best evidence on how many manorial tenants there were in Lincolnshire comes from an inquiry of 1398. This names at least 74 homagers, 443 free tenants, and 52 bond tenants. Among them were some of the most powerful men in the country, starting with John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, holder of manorial land at Wrangle. One function of such courts was to bring to the Lord's attention opportunities to levy feudal incidents, relief, wardship and marriage. These provided income and an important source of local influence and patronage. Virtually every surviving manorial account reveals court perquisites as a significant source of revenue. But the courts had to function for long periods with only distant supervision because of their lord's absenteeism. Naturally, abuses arose. A royal inquest in 1341 reveals the misdeeds of Gilbert Lederer, County Exeter, and his minions. They had exploited uncertainties over the status of manorial land and the identity of the present lord. Was it Edward III or was it John III, Earl since 1334? Fraudulently extorting considerable sums from the tenants of Quadring and Washingborough. In another dispute, 4 bailiffs of Boston had colluded to deprive a man of £20, a fine falsely levied in the Earl of Richmond's court at Boston, of which one of them was also the clerk. As such cases show, the Count Earl Duke's estates were administered by local officers in principle answerable to their lord. Thanks to surviving accounts from the 1370s, the careers of some of these can be brought into focus. Further evidence from 1398 reveals that some officers were freemen, some bondmen, some had commercial interests in Boston. They answered to the steward or seneschal of Richmond, the honour's highest official, while a county receiver of money was accountable to the Duke Earl's English Receiver General. This hierarchical structure was replicated in other counties where the honour had estates. It created a network of officials who had a vested interest in maintaining a well-developed bureaucratic system, almost regardless of who their lord was. Occasionally, however, they might have been reminded of Richmond's Breton contracts and connections by some very rare material evidence. When the gentleman antiquary Gervase Hollis visited Fulbeck Church on the eve of the English Civil War, he spotted at the east end of the chancel arms that he blazoned as those of the Dukes of Brittany and Earls of Richmond of the House of Dreux. He found the same arms in the south window of Sutterton Church. This had been granted to Crowland Abbey by John Earl of Richmond in 1313, along with lands that had previously been gifted to the monks by his father, John II. Some honorial officers were also commemorated. At Bicker, Hollis copied an inscription from the south window: "Pray for the soul of John of Winsby, seneschal of the Earl of Richmond." Winsby had flourished around 1300. This is a meagre harvest from what must once have been a rich source of visual reminders of the honour and its lords. But it raises the general questions about their and other Bretons' religious interests. At the Conquest, the church in Lincolnshire was far from flourishing. After the Danish invasions, there was no longer a bishop nor see of Lindsey. Lincolnshire formed part of the Mercian see of Dorchester-on-Thames. Crowland was the only active monastery of early foundation. All Anglo-Saxon nunneries had been completely destroyed. Local provision for pastoral care was patchy. All this changed dramatically post-1066. In 1072, Remigius, Bishop of Dorchester, removed his see to Lincoln to build a cathedral fit to be mother church of the whole diocese. The Gregorian reform movement helped free the church from lay control. It introduced more ascetic practices alongside older forms of Benedictine monasticism, evoking an enthusiastic response across a wide social spectrum. With the arrival after 1100 of the Cistercians, Reformed Austin canons, Premonstratensians, and Lincolnshire's own distinctive mixed order of Sempringham, consisting of clerics and nuns, laymen and lay women, a wide choice opened up for any with a monastic vocation. Following the recapture of Jerusalem, crusading also sparked enthusiasm. This manifested itself locally in support particularly for the Templars and the Hospitallers. What part did Bretons take in these developments? Initially, they patronised houses outside the county with grants from their Lincolnshire estates. Count Alan Rufus's gift to the Church of St Botolph's to St Mary's Abbey, York, has long been recognised as the earliest deed relating to the future town of Boston. Other Yorkshire houses benefiting from Lincolnshire estates included Selby, the Austin canons of Guisborough and Bridlington. They also made grants to houses in western France, particularly to dynamic ones from the Loire Valley. These had largely supplanted Breton monasteries in promoting religious reforms in the duchy. So it's not surprising that Geoffroy de la Guerche patronised Saint Nicolas d'Angers, not far from his birthplace, granting lands and tithes, including Axholme. Two of Count Alan's few surviving charters were also in favour of Saint Nicolas d'Angers. Spalding Priory was refounded in 1074 as a dependency of that abbey. 4 Breton houses benefited from grants in Lincolnshire. The earliest was that of the Cistercians of Begard, to which Count Earl Alan III granted property in Gayton-le-Wold around 1146. However, since Gayton was far from the abbey, in 1154 Abbot Omnisius was asked by the monks of the newly established Cistercian Abbey of Kirkstead to transfer it to them. Begard's principal local interest thereafter was a pension from tithes on the fairs at Boston, still being paid in the late 14th century. Duchess Constance similarly conferred £10 from the fair on her foundation of La Villeneuve. Another Cistercian house, Langanay, was given land in Saltfleetby. West Ravendale, established shortly after 1202, the only Breton priory in the county, has already been mentioned. By 1220, Bishop Hugh of Wells had ordained a vicar to serve a church of West Ravendale. He was to receive a food allowance equivalent to that of a canon of Beauport, together with 13 and 4pence a year for his clothing, all expenses to be borne by the abbey. Beauport was not always scrupulous in meeting its obligations, at least according to Richard of Coates, vicar in 1289, who complained that food supplied by the priory was wanting in meat. The abbey's proctor in England, usually the Prior of Ravendale, is named fairly frequently in English records. Some were obvious Bretons like Raoul, Prior in 1235, Samson in 1298, or Olivier Geslin between 1349 and 1361. Canons of Beauport sent to serve for a few years in England. The outbreak of the 100 Years' War made their journeys across the Channel more hazardous. On the 28th of May 1342, Edward III, shortly to lead an expedition into the duchy, confirmed Beauport's rights in England. Ravendale's immunity was finally removed in 1414. It was delivered to the Dowager Queen, Jeanne de Navarre, as part of her dower. She had previously been the third wife of John IV of Brittany, before marrying Henry IV in 1403. After her death in 1437, the priory returned to the king. On the 18th of March 1439, Henry VI granted it to Southwell Minster to bolster the endowments for minor clergy. In 2020, the Commissioners of the Church of England still own Priory Farm, West Ravendale, a remarkable record of ecclesiastical possession originating in a Breton landholder's gift of Lincolnshire land around 1185. What about other Breton benefactions? After 1066, 129 religious houses were established or refounded in the county over the rest of the Middle Ages, most of them in the 12th century. The majority remained small cells or priories, generally attached to a larger community, like West Ravendale. At Alvingham, a small double house was established for Gilbert of Sempringham's new order by some knights around 1146. This attracted patronage from several families donating land they held of the honour of Richmond. Count Alan III and his widow, Dowager Countess Bertha, were modest patrons. Some years earlier, Alan de Camp had founded Freeston as a cell of Roland, and he was a benefactor of Louth Park Abbey and Spalding Priory. Udo of Gainsby and his son Ralph of Aby founded Greenfield Priory for Cistercian nuns before 1153. Hugh, son of Udo of Spirewick, in founding Kirkstead in 1139, was perhaps the most successful Breton patron. Here all now that remains are the monumental angle of the south transept, and outside the precinct St Leonard's Chapel, perhaps intended as the Tattershall's mortuary chapel. Most sites once patronised by Breton families are now mere humps in a field. This is true of even the major ones like Sempricum, once a very grand priory. Other, like Swinshead Abbey, have largely been covered by modern buildings. Among visitors in the 1370s were John IV and his wife Joan Holland. She had inherited Stenning Manor in Swinshead parish, where she stayed for several months in the winter of 1377-8. More extensive, though again now masked by later developments, are parish churches with Breton connections. The most visually spectacular is obviously St Botolph's, Boston, though it owes very little directly to the Count Earls. Conan IV gave the advowson of Gayton le Wold to Kirkstead, that of Yarborough to Brian de Bretagne, confirmed his predecessors' grants of St Botolph's, and that of Long Bennington Church by Raoul of Fougères to the Abbey of Savigny, as well as giving Donnington in Holland to the Templars. Of the 12 1/4 churches held locally by Count Alan in 1086, the honour only possessed one in 1282, Fulbecht, though it then owned at least 13 other advowsons. Yet work has yet to be done systematically on how successive Count Earls exploited their patronage of these churches to reward clerics in their services. An early interesting example is Peter Mauclair presenting the Chancellor of his duchy, Gerard, to the living of Washingborough around 1233. Most churches given by proprietorial lords in the 12th and 13th centuries to religious houses or to Lincoln Cathedral have been changed out of all recognition, with very little original fabric now surviving. But the impressively large churches that were later built on Richmond and Oriel Manor, like those closely clustered at Friskney, Wrangle, Old Leek, Leverton, Freeston and Skirbick, and beyond to Wyberton, Bicker and Boston, can be noted. They reflect the wealth created by that great wave of reclamation culminating around 1300. Finally, regarding ecclesiastical patronage, it is worth remarking how many ordinary priests witnessing early charters bore characteristic Breton names. To take a small example from Stenton's Gilbertine charters, there are naturally Allans, but also Yodos, Landry, parson at either East or West Wickham, Walter, son of Allan, clerk of North Willingham, and Wigan, a priest. Others include at least 2 with university degrees, Master Joss, clerk of Ludford, and Master Allan, son of Wigan. Some were monks or canons, like Brother Elias of Walcott, and Udo, probably a canon of Cately Priory, and Winnimer, subdean of Lincoln. Among others of probable Breton descent in the chapter of Lincoln, there were no fewer than 7 early Allans with unknown prebends, and a Harvey who died round about 1188. Perhaps the most distinguished man of Breton descent to make his career there was Hamo Brito, appointed Chancellor probably before 1148, dying in 1182. At Yarborough, Hamelin the Dean, dead by 1210, who was succeeded by his own brother, Hamelin Croc, were sons of Osbert the Dean, and both married men themselves. Their origins were probably Norman rather than Breton, but Hamelin the Dean's son, Brian, married a Constance, and the family's fortunes were inextricably bound up with those of their Breton neighbour, Jickle of Yarborough, a classic example of the ethnic integration which had occurred since the conquest. I must conclude. On Sunday the 11th of October 1377, Duke John IV of Brittany and his wife threw a banquet in their mansion at Boston for the burgesses on what is their only known visit to the town. Ordinary and Gascon wine flowed freely, as did 68 gallons of ale, copious amounts of beef, mutton and pork, 18 sucking piglets, 5 swans, 22 geese, 35 capon, 73 chickens, 4 dozen pigeons, 5 curlew, 18 plovers and 22 dozen small birds provided the main courses. No fewer than 500 eggs, 4 gallons of milk, garlic, onions, oats, apples, pears and plums were used too, as were 6 pounds of almonds, 1.5 pounds of cinnamon, 4 pounds of sugar and other spices released from store or bought in Boston. Costs amounted to more than 5 times the normal daily expenditure of the household. But it was a swan song. On John's death in 1399, the honour was lost to his successors, breaking ties with Lincolnshire that had lasted well over 300 years. In this address, I have tried to show that with regard to the conquest and the subsequent settlement of Bretons in Lincolnshire, there were significant feudal, institutional and administrative developments, as Breton lords, chief among them those of Richmond, came to possess wide estates in the county. They played their part in local, national and international affairs, though little has been said here on the complex diplomatic and military aspects of Anglo-Breton relations over the same period. We have seen that the honour of Richmond developed to the point where it functioned despite frequent changes of lord and long periods of absence. It should have become evident that there were also interesting social, economic and cultural developments too, affecting ordinary men and women, which Lincolnshire Bretons experienced alongside new neighbours. Thanks to anthroponymy, the Breton presence can be traced over many generations because of long-lasting naming practices. These show geographical distribution and indicate density of settlement. Although acknowledged by some scholars, this Breton presence has been frequently overlooked, dismissed, or worst of all, said to be Norman. Here we have traced not only leading Breton families, but also more obscure people from Brittany, who followed their lords to England. Moreover, we have pursued them and their descendants over a surprisingly long period. The nature of continuing contacts with their previous homeland have only been briefly touched on in part. Unfortunately, time restraints have precluded an examination of how those of Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Scandinavian stock from Lincolnshire established links with Brittany, chiefly by entering the service of the Lords of Richmond. However, how social and cultural ties tended over time to bring together those of very different ethnic origins has been briefly explained. So I hope that even this partial discussion of some aspects of Lincolnshire's Breton connections reminds us of how complex our shared past is, but also how much yet there is still to discover. Thank you very much for listening.